After World War II, America didn't just win battles, it won the economic future. Factories that once built tanks began churning out cars. Soldiers came home, started families, and built a middle class unlike anything the world had ever seen. And at the heart of it all? The US dollar, no longer just paper but a symbol of stability, confidence, and global power. But even in those golden years, the seeds of inflation were quietly being planted. The year was 1945. Europe was in ruins. Britain was broke, France was rebuilding, and the global economy needed a new anchor. That anchor was the US dollar. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement, the world's major currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself was tied to gold, $35 an ounce. It was simple, predictable, and powerful. While the British pound had been the world's reserve currency for centuries, America's industrial strength and wartime savings gave it a new throne. By 1950, two-thirds of all global gold reserves were sitting in the U.S. The message was clear. If you trusted the dollar, you trusted prosperity. The 1950s and 60s brought something miraculous, an explosion of middle-class wealth. Families bought homes, cars, televisions, luxuries that once belonged only to the rich. One steady paycheck could buy comfort, security, and even a vacation. Compare that to post-war Britain. Rationing continued there until 1954. In France, people were still struggling to rebuild bombed cities. But in America, you could walk into a diner, pay 15 cents for a burger, and feel like life was limitless. Yet, while everyone was living the dream, something subtle began to shift. As Europe and Japan rebuilt, they started exporting more goods. American companies, once unrivaled, now faced competition. Dollars began flowing overseas, fast. Foreign governments, flush with U.S. cash, began converting those dollars back into gold. And with every shipment of gold leaving Fort Knox, America's grip on global finance loosened a little more. By 1965, France's President Charles de Gaulle openly challenged the dollar's supremacy. He accused the U.S. of exporting inflation, printing money and paying debts with paper instead of metal. Britain, still recovering from empire loss, couldn't compete. But France? France wanted gold, and demanded it. So, as shiploads of gold sailed across the Atlantic, the American illusion of infinite wealth began to crack. The 1960s were loud, music, protests, rockets to the moon, but beneath it all, a quiet economic tension brewed. President Lyndon B. Johnson launched the Great Society programs and escalated the Vietnam War, both incredibly expensive. To fund them, the government printed more money. But printing money without backing it in gold? That was like inflating a balloon in a locked room. The pressure had to go somewhere. Meanwhile, inflation started creeping in. Prices of gas, groceries, and housing began to rise, almost imperceptibly. A dollar still looked the same, but it didn't buy as much. Compare that to Britain, where inflation was higher but the pound had already fallen from its imperial peak. In France, de Gaulle's government tightened spending, hoping to preserve the franc's dignity. But in America, spending was the new patriotic act. By 1971, the United States faced an impossible choice. Foreign governments were demanding gold for their dollars, and the vaults were running dry. So President Richard Nixon made a bold move. In a televised address on August 15, 1971, he declared the U.S. would no longer convert dollars into gold. In one sentence, Nixon ended the Bretton Woods system and set the dollar free. The dollar was no longer a promise of metal. It was now a promise of faith, in the government, in the economy, and in America's word. Many economists called it the Nixon shock. And it was, to Britain, France, Japan, to the whole world. Because when America sneezed, the world caught a cold. The 1970s dawned with uncertainty. Oil crises, inflation, and stagnation. But despite the chaos, the dollar survived, and even thrived. It wasn't backed by gold anymore. It was backed by something else, global trust. America's economy, its military, and its innovation made the dollar too central to fail. Even as other currencies struggled, the dollar remained the world's financial backbone. Compared to Britain's inflation-ridden 1970s and France's turbulent currency reforms, America's dollar, though shaky, stood tall. The post-war boom had ended, but the dollar's dominance had only deepened. No longer a symbol of gold, now a symbol of belief. And that belief, that the American dollar could outlast any crisis, would be tested again and again in the decades to come. So, what happens when faith itself becomes currency?